Growing up, my grandma always told me that the land took care of us and it still is taking care of us, and it never asks for anything back.
Everything is connected, and it's not humans and animals or humans and the nature around us. We're all connected.
And that acknowledgement is a way to acknowledge that we're coexisting in this land with the native people, and we should acknowledge that this is actually their traditional territory. But at the same time, we are all guests to this land.
The land plays a big factor in who we are. That's what makes us strong. That's what makes us strong people.
Hello, friends. I'm Barry Shiffman, Artistic Director of the Banff International String Quartet Festival and Competition here in beautiful Banff, Alberta. Today, I'm joined in conversation with my dear friend, and in fact, friend of many of you that have been to Banff, have listened to music in Canada, Cellist Denis Brott, who's joining us today from his beautiful home in the Laurentians. Welcome, Denis.
Hi, Barry.
So, as we've been dealing with this pandemic for the last 16 months, it's affected all of us in many different ways. We've dealt with putting concerts online. We've dealt with having our children going to school from home. We've dealt with not being able to go to restaurants, and with reading the headlines of so many people that have been afflicted with this COVID-19 situation. And now we're at the point where we're coming out of this pandemic and life is beginning to return to somewhat more normal. Concerts are starting to happen again. And there's a real positivity that I think is starting to sweep across the country, which is a wonderful thing. When I say the word positivity, and I look at you, Denis, those two things go hand in hand. You have been a beacon of positivity through a harrowing experience with this pandemic, which I really appreciate that you're going to share what that was and the lessons learned from that. But take us back to what was really the beginning of this crisis. You had just returned from concerts in Europe, and this would be back in a year ago, February, wasn't it? Or March, I guess.
It was early March, yeah.
March. And so you just played concerts. I think you flew in from Amsterdam, if I remember.
That's correct. I'd been in London playing with the Barbican Quartet, actually.
Yeah.
And the cellist in that quartet is a former student of mine, Joanna Prodanova. So it was particularly lovely. And we did that same concert that we did in London in a small town in Holland called Ommen. And as you know, I teach at the Netherlands String Quartet Academy. So I go to Europe 5 times at least every year for 2 weeks. So this was one of my trips. Started in mid-February, and I got home on the 11th of March.
Now, ordinarily, Denis, when you and I have a pretty close relationship, and if I would have expected to hear from you when you get back from Europe, and we'd share stories, and I didn't hear from you. And shame on me for not reaching out, but I didn't hear from you for a week, for 2 weeks, for 3 weeks. I didn't know what happened to Denis. I figured you were back home and everything was fine. And that wasn't what was going on, though, was it?
Not at all. Well, in point of fact, I didn't know what was going on. We're talking about, let's see, as I say, the 11th of March. I remember the dates almost like it was a calendar in my head, very vivid. Got back on the 11th, which was a Tuesday of March 2020, of course. And by the Friday, which was, if one is superstitious, Friday the 13th of March, when I spiked a fever of 40 degrees and thought, okay, I had a cold, I would really bad grip. Did the usual chicken soup, stay in bed thing, but it didn't go away. And of course, I'd heard about this. People in Europe had been quite aware of the virus. We were also in Canada, but it hadn't quite developed in the way it had already in Europe. So bottom line, trying to get a COVID test was not an easy matter. And after staying on the phone for hours and hours, falling asleep with the phone by my pillow on hold, being disconnected, or waking up to discover that I heard a dial tone. So they must have answered, but it was 3 o'clock in the morning and I was in the middle of a sleep and with a 40-degree fever. Anyway, long story short, it took a week to get a test. And all this while I was in a bad way. I had to drive. I live in the country and it's an hour drive. So I had to drive into Montreal for this COVID test at the Hôtel Dieu hospital. And I'll never forget, because of course, driving with a fever is already disorienting enough. But I arrived in the parking lot at 5 o'clock and there was a line of 300 people that snaked around the lot. And they were handing out masks and you had no option but to get in line. So I got in line and I lasted in line about 2 hours and then I collapsed. I remember going to the guard and saying, I don't feel very well. And that's all I remember. I blacked out. And the next thing I remember is that I was on a stretcher and they were taking me to the hospital. And long story short, I ended up at the CHUM hospital, which is short for Centre Hospitalier de l'Université de Montréal, which is the University of Montreal hospital, brand spanking new hospital complex. And I was indeed the first COVID-19 ICU patient, not a distinction I care to wear around my neck. Although I do have the battle scars around my neck to prove it. The bottom line is that the next day I was put into the ICU in an induced coma. And I stayed there with a trach tube and an artificial respirator and all sorts of other machines for 32 days. And I have, of course, no precise recollection of that period of time, an induced coma being a state of absence of consciousness. I do, in retrospect, remember the journeys that my mind went through during that period of time, because as a result of having been put on some rather serious drugs to keep me in this induced coma, things like propofol and Seroquel and Haldol, these cocktail of drugs that, you know, in the 70s, people experimented with for the ultimate high. I was in no high, I was in a low. My oxygenation level went down to 70. They called my family and said, this isn't looking good. Of course, nobody could come to see me because I was in isolation. I ultimately, without sparing you the gory details, I came out of the coma 32 days later, still with a trach tube. I remember waking up with a trach tube and being conscious but unable to speak and being aware of people around me. And don't forget, I didn't know at the time what had happened. I had no idea that I had COVID. I had no idea it was in an intensive care isolation ward, what exactly was going on. And of course, I couldn't talk. I suffered a great deal. This was not an easy time, nor has it been an easy recovery. Everything that you read about long haulers in any magazine, certainly that I've read, I'm sure you've read, New York Times and certainly the Globe and so on and so forth, it's all true. These horrific nightmares, the hallucinations, the loss of empowerment and consciousness, the loss of control, and and really climbing out of a deep depth where, in my case, I couldn't walk. I couldn't dial on my phone or iPad. My hands were literally, I remember seeing them trembling in front of my hands and say, what is going on here? Being unable to stand, all of that. Anyway, 45 days later, I got out of the hospital. It was May 4th. Spring had come and gone, and it was the beginning of summer. I, of course, could not look after myself. And since I live alone, I needed help. They wanted to put me in a rehab center, and I was adamant against that. And I had enough will at that time to absolutely refuse it. I have to say, I got world-class care at this CHUM hospital in Montreal. They had a litany of doctors, specialists, pulmonologists, cardiologists, nephrologists, you name it, because aside from COVID lung, I also developed a bacterial infection in my lungs. I developed liver failure. I developed kidney failure. It was a house of cards. So I had an amazing army of doctors. Of course, later I learned to get to know them. I do want to mention, though, there was one amazing human experience in the hospital. Of course, after the ICU and the coma, there was an oncologist whose name was Dr. Pierre Rousseau, who was an amateur violinist. And he was studying the violin as an adult doctor with one of my former chamber music students. And she told him that I was in his hospital because she'd read about it somehow. I think it was in one of the papers. I don't know. And so he looked me up. And from the moment he discovered me, so to speak, he was my only daily recognizable visitor, because all of the people who came and went looked like Martians. They wore hazmat suits, goggles. You couldn't see their eyes because the goggles sort of were tinted. I have very, very distinct memories of all of that, and all of the gear that they needed to wear in order to stay safe and sanitary. But for some reason, he wore a mask, but that was it. So he came in and introduced himself and told me he was a violinist. And he said, I couldn't talk, right? I had this tube in my mouth. He said, I bet you want to listen to some music. I'm going to bring you a CD player. So the next day he showed up with a CD player and a pair of headphones, and he put them on my ears, and he brought with him the 6 Bach suites with Yo-Yo Ma, as it so happened. I put this in the CD player, and suddenly this calmed me in a way that I hadn't been calm prior to that, because I was really in quite a state of panic, to be frank.
Yo-Yo, it's an interesting choice because Yo-Yo is a friend of yours. I mean, for many years. So I think that was a wise choice.
In fact, well, I don't think it was a choice, an active choice. It just happened. It was a sort of chance. Yes, we were students together from a remarkably early age, actually, at the Juilliard School, and I was there as a 12, 13-year-old on Saturdays for lessons with Leonard Rose. There was this 8-year-old kid who had his lesson before me, and I would listen at the door and say, I'll never play as good as that. That's totally depressing. Anyhow, so yeah, but the bad news was that I didn't know how to operate the machine. So it kept playing the same track over and over and over again, which literally drove me crazy after a certain time. Anyway, this wonderful doctor, Pierre Rousseau, visited me really religiously every day, spent 20 minutes with me. Ultimately, I was able to talk with him when they took this tube out of my throat. And we've since developed a wonderful friendship. So that's really quite a remarkable thing. But he was a bit of a savior because I couldn't see any member of my family. And as I say, everybody looked somewhat from outer space that came into my room, and I was in isolation, of course. Anyway, coming home, my son, Joshua, who lives in Toronto, who you know, came from Toronto. He was working, of course, remotely, as everybody was. And he came and lived with me. And he ushered me through this very frightening period of time for me, because I could not do anything. I walked into the house with a walker like an, invalid man who had aged, 30 years or something. I could not put on my socks. I couldn't get up from a chair. I mean, it was just ridiculous.
Denis, you're going to take us through the story, but I just think for those of you that are joining us on this call, to give some perspective. So when we were setting up to plan the recording of this, we had to make time because Denis swims 1 kilometer across the lake daily. So clearly your recovery defies what was expected. I can tell you, and we have had this conversation, your family did reach out to me, and not to share that you had come off the respirator and things were good, but rather to prepare for the worst, because we didn't think you were going to make it. And so began some communications with a number of musicians in the quartet world, where I shared that things were not looking very good. And for many of us, you were the first person that we knew that was really in this, and it really it put so many things in perspective. Friendships, music, the extraordinary riches that we have been enjoying in our friendships, in our music making. Suddenly we're all called into question as we saw this. So now you're out of the hospital, you're at home, you're getting extraordinary care. You've listened to this Bach suite in the hospital. Your hands are trembling. You lost 25 kilos, as I remember. The conversations I had with you had a singular purpose of getting back on the cello. And I remember trying to counsel you that, maybe that's not, it's important, but maybe that's not the most important thing right now. And you were quite committed that was the most important thing, was getting your health back, and that playing the cello was part and parcel of that.
Well, look, many of your audience members I know are musicians themselves, amateurs. And I think we all concur that music is a language that starts where words end. And for me, the emotional connection with my instrument and the fear that I had lost it put me in a state of panic.
Sure.
And gave urgency to my need to get back to the instrument. And yes, I remember well that you counseled me not to, and you were probably right, because I went back to it too early meaning that, and to give your listeners a sense, I think I felt kind of like a 5-year-old might feel when they first take a bow in their hand and try and pull it across a string, and it just skates. You don't have a sense of your own weight. Of course, with the trembling as well, and all that I was dealing with, there was no question of pulling a sound out of the instrument. It just didn't come. And, so my first challenge and goal was to be able to play open strings. So when I say it's kind of like when you start an instrument, it really was. And that is psychologically an extremely difficult position to be in, certainly for someone who is a professional player. I did not lack for willpower and desire. And so I just kept at it. when I started to put my fingers on the strings, it felt literally like the end of a nail. Where the finger touched the string was like barbed wire or the tip of a nail. It was excruciating. Of course, I'd lost all my calluses on my fingertips. Anyway, the whole process was part of a total physical process of rehabilitation, which meant not only regaining all the muscle mass that I had lost and the weight that I had lost, which was all part of the whole thing. So it took a long time.
But you did figure out how to play open strings. You did figure out how to use your fingers, and it wasn't too long after you were home that you, and I thought this was extremely moving, you played the Kol Nidre, the prayer that is sung at the Yom Kippur service of the Jewish high holiday season, and the Kol Nidre is a piece that is sung by cantor that is put to music, as we know, by Max Bruch, and is one of the great cello solos. And somehow, miraculously, you presented that at synagogue.
It is a bit of a miracle, but such was my desire to do it. I'm a person who has to be goal-oriented, or is goal-oriented by nature. And challenges play an important role in giving me direction in life in general. And this was almost an ultimate challenge. Can you manage to do this? And interestingly enough, if you look at that video closely, and the close-ups of that video, and by the way, I went to the synagogue and recorded it without any parishioners there, obviously. My nails had, as they say, the nails are the windows into your body. Well, my nails had become completely deformed during the period of time in the coma, and they had ripples on them, starting right where the cuticle was or is, and as time passed, growing out, and now has grown out completely. But you could see when I was unconscious by the position of the ripple on my nail. Anyway, so if you look at that video closely, and of course I only noticed this, I guess maybe other people do too, you can actually see that, that it had made it about halfway up my nail. So I was halfway recovered. But anyway, I did it, and remarkably, it wasn't too terrible, and I managed. And it was an important first step for me. It was the first time I played, so it was like 5 months after having COVID, and 4 months after getting home. But it's a long journey. All I can say to you is that this story reminds me a little bit of course, when I have 4 children, as you know, and whenever the time of year came for the Passover celebration at home, I always took it very much with a grain of salt and tried to make humor out of the event. And of course, Passover services tend to be extremely long before you have time. It gets to the point of actually eating your meal. You've been sitting at the table for 2.5 hours. So I feel a little bit like that now when I'm telling you this story. And I always used to say, well, the story of Passover is they tried to kill us. They failed. We escaped. Let's eat.
Well,
but look, Barry, I could go on and on about this. Maybe this is boring.
You mentioned this performance of Kol Nidre. We actually want to share a video that you made, not of that Kol Nidre piece, but of a similarly affecting piece, which is the prayer of Ernest Bloch, which again is a piece I associate with you, and it's something that from the looks of this recording, you just put it down in your house. There's no audience. It's a very intimate and kind of beautiful image of you and your cello communing, I think is very special. So let's take a minute and let's watch this performance of Bloch's prayer, and then you can tell us a bit about that. Let's enjoy. Wow, Dennis, that was a treat. Thank you for sharing that video. As I said before, there's something very beautiful about that work, witnessing just you with your cello in your home, it's extremely powerful, maybe more powerful than it would have been in a real concert setting. I mean, we really feel this conversation between you and your instrument is very beautiful. Denis, you know that so much of your career has been about supporting emerging artists, in addition to all of the extraordinary work that you've done for yourself. And it seems as soon as you had your strength back, the focus again for you is around emerging artists, and there's almost a kind of manic commitment to this. You shared a project with me. Again, I probably counseled you that, that sounds like an awfully big project. Maybe that's not what you want to be taking on right now. And like most of it goes in one ear and out the other, and
Oh.
and you've put together an extraordinary project. You've basically created an orchestra of wonderful young musicians, the best young musicians you could find. You found funding to pay them to go and play concerts in the community this fall. Tell us a bit about what you're up to with this project.
Well, first of all, I want to point out that probably the people who suffered most, and I'm not talking about victims of COVID now, the people who suffered as a result of the impact COVID had on their lives, is not the professional musician, is not you or I, for that matter, professionally speaking, because we both have jobs and are used to having a salary. It's the young person recently graduated from university, music school, what have you, setting out on their career, waiting to do auditions, waiting to participate in competitions, and suddenly the rug literally pulled out from under them and there's nothing, zero. I also, as you know, run a festival called the Montreal Chamber Music Festival, which in 2020 was to have celebrated its quarter century anniversary, 25th year. And of course, that didn't see the light of day, and nor did this June 2021. But as soon as I could put two thoughts together, I began to think about other people and what I could do constructively to help. I think doing that gives purpose to life, helping other people, being of value, contributing to society. And I don't mean that in any altruistic way. It's something that it's like a life force inside me that I need to do. I have to do it. And so even before I could play and had my full capacities, we had to reorientate the festival from being a live festival, as you did with Bisque and the Banff Festival, into being a virtual festival. So we created something called Festival Reimagined. When I say we, it is really, we have a skeleton staff of Julie and myself and maybe one other person. And so I developed a digital program called A Day in the Life. And A Day in the Life was to chronicle exactly what I'm talking about. What was a day in the life for somebody recently graduated from music school and suddenly not having any food on the table? I mean, in many cases, literally so. And so we created a 10-part series, offered employment, asked these wonderful young people, many of whom you're audience members, and you, of course, know, people like Timothy Chewy and Cameron Crozman, and, the list is impressive. And we have a lot to be proud of here in this country of brilliant young talent. So I asked them each to record their day, how they got up in the morning, what they did first thing in the morning, how they kept in shape physically, mentally, what they did to keep themselves motivated to practice. Because, you have to be motivated to practice. It's not just practicing. It's like anybody who, does physical exercise, you do it for a reason or you have some routine. Anyway, we came up with these fantastic 10 videos. which are currently on the Festival Montreal website and were on the violin channel and listened to by literally tens of thousands of people. We then did something called Home from Away, because Canadian artists who didn't live in Canada couldn't come home, couldn't come back here to play. So I thought, okay, well, let's bring them back digitally, virtually speaking. So I asked James Ennis, all our mutual friends and friends of the festival, Montreal Chamber Music Festival, as much as friends of Bisque, of course, James Ennis, John Kimura Parker, the St. Lawrence Quartet, in which you used to be a member, Joseph Kaiser, the wonderful tenor, Metropolitan Opera star living in Chicago, and Martin Beaver. And so these people all generously created 40 to 50-minute videos in which they talked about what they did, showed themselves amusing themselves, whether it was Jimmy on a toboggan sliding down a hill, or Martin walking in the hot sunny mountains of Southern California, or whatever it is. Everybody in their own individual way, creating a portrait that is, in my opinion, completely unique because they didn't do it otherwise, I don't think, for anybody else. So it was very special, and I'm extremely grateful to all these people. This Home from Away series is also on the festival website. But then again, when the idea of playing concerts seemed very, very far away, I came up with an idea of, how do we bring back music to the streets of Montreal, making it accessible to people, even safely socially distanced or otherwise. Of course, nobody had a crystal ball. Nobody could look into what would be happening in the fall of 2021. So I applied to the city, Ville de Montréal, the city of Montreal, to create this Les Jeunes Virtuoses de Montréal, the Young Virtuosi of Montreal, essentially a 15-member string orchestra, to perform in every and all manner of locations where people haven't heard music, from a shopping center to a retirement home to a street corner that what might be possible to do it in for acoustic and other reasons. I never thought I'd get the funding, because I was convinced of one thing, and that is we were not going to ask these young people, don't forget, directed at recent graduates of music schools. We weren't going to ask them to play for cheap or to donate their services or undermine the quality of their talent and accomplishment. So I said, the only way we're doing this is if these people are paid according to union scale and no less. So basically, these people are all making $1,000 each a week for 6 weeks. So they're 15 people. You can get a sense of the budget. It's over $100,000. And so, miracle of miracles, not expecting, be careful what you wish for. I got this funding, and suddenly, oh my God, what do I do? Like, how am I going to organize this? So we found out about this mid-June, and we are holding auditions. I have a wonderful virtual audition committee made up of Andrew Wan, the concertmaster of the Montreal Symphony, and Victor Fournel-Blanc, the first violist of the Montreal Symphony, and myself, and we'll listen to all these people. And we've had close to 20 applications so far, more than what we need. And some of the people I can't mention right now, but they are people you and I know, and your audience knows. The really new wave of young talent in this country. And I'm looking forward to a crackerjack ensemble. And not only that, I'm going to include them in the first live concert of the festival, in which you're playing on October 18th. And I've commissioned a script about Mahler's relationship to Beethoven and Schubert. And of course, Mahler transcribed the Opus 95 string quartet of Beethoven and the Death and the Maiden string quartet of Schubert for a large string ensemble. So we'll all be playing that, and the concertmaster will be Andrew Wan, and the first violist will be you, and I'll be the first cellist, and the bass will be the associate principal of the Montreal Symphony, and otherwise the entire ensemble will be these amazing young talents. So it's going to be very exciting.
But Dennis, just hearing your crescendo of enthusiasm as you talk about it, this is what I'm saying. There's no stopping you. And lucky for those young musicians to have 6 weeks of work and 6 weeks of experience, and 6 weeks of making music for the community that has been starved. So hats off to you. Dennis, it's great to hear your enthusiasm for this project, to see the energy and your commitment again to these extraordinary young musicians who need you. It's great to see you healthy again. And I can tell you that our president, Janice Price, was deeply moved by your story and to see your recovery. You know how close you've been to the Banff Center, and we were all thrilled that you pulled through this the way you did with such grace, and that you're playing again is just another gift. So keep doing that. When Banff is ready to receive musicians, I hope that you'll be able to come back safely. Thank you for sharing your story with us, Dennis. It's a very personal one, and for those of us on this call that are joining, the International String Quartet Festival, the International String Quartet Competition is a very personal experience. We are all very close to each other, having spent a week in Banff for what are those magical experiences, and we consider you part of our family. And again, thank you for openly sharing and showing us that that good things can come from the most dire of times. It's great to see you. And
thanks, Barry. Banff, I just want to say Banff holds a very special spot in my heart, and so do you, as you know. What you have been doing there, what Banff has been doing for young musicians, for music on a larger scale, is not only unique, it is impactful in most meaningful ways, as much for performers, aspiring young musicians, as for the incredible audience, unique audience that you have when you are allowed to bring people onto campus, these 500 eager people, some of them octa and nonagenarians who are to be found in the bar playing string quartets at 11 and 12 o'clock at night. So it's such a unique place, and I love you for what you're doing. And I am so really touched that you reached out to talk to me about this. I thank you for your interest, and let's keep doing everything we can to encourage the best this country has to offer.
You've got our word on that. Thank you, Dennis.